شغال المايك. مساء الخير، السلام عليكم. اعتذر اني راح اتكلم بالانجليزي بس عشان كتبت الورك بالانجليزي. So before I start, I only have 20 minutes. Everyone only has 20 minutes, and the subjects that we're talking about are very complicated and difficult. And in 20 minutes, it's only possible to say a few things which I try and make as simple as possible. But I know that the things I'm going to talk about are much more complicated than I can make them sound. And in particular, maybe it's difficult to talk about things after the war this summer, since I wrote most of this paper before the war, and obviously it's much too soon to know exactly what the effect of the war this summer will be in the long term. So I've adapted it a little bit, but in the end, these are very kind of tentative thoughts. But in general, I'm not going to make an argument myself, especially. I'm really just going to describe some things that I came across or I read on social media, for example, during the war, things that people were saying and that seems to pose particularly interesting questions about the relationship between the West Bank and Gaza 10 years almost after Israeli disengagement from the Gaza Strip, 9 years or 8 years after the elections in 2006, and 7 years since the Inqisam. That's quite a long period of time, and so some of the structural features of that period are really what I'm trying to think about here. So after that very long introduction, what I'm going to try and think about is a few questions in the aftermath of the war this summer and of the last 10 years in general. The questions are very simple. They are, when people talk, and people talk a lot, about the need to express solidarity with Gaza from the West Bank, what are they talking about when people talk about solidarity? What does it mean in practice? What are the difficulties of expressing solidarity in practice? What are the political limits to what can actually, and the military limits to what can actually be done from the West Bank when Gaza is being bombed like it was this summer, for example? And what does that say about the ways in which the occupation, the experience of the occupation has become a bit different in Gaza, more than a bit different in Gaza and the West Bank in the last 10 years. Now, the key point here is that before the Israeli disengagement, let's call it, I'll just call it the Insurrection from now on, just as a shorthand, from Gaza in 2005. Before 2005, Gaza was occupied. After 2005, Gaza was occupied. That's very straightforward. Before 2005, the West Bank and East Jerusalem were occupied. Today, the West Bank and East Jerusalem are occupied. So occupation still absolutely unites the West Bank, Gaza, and East Jerusalem. But the way that occupation looks and feels on a daily basis has become very different in the last 10 years. Now, there are many reasons why, but one of the reasons is that after the end of the Intifada in 2005, Israel has had one main priority, arguably, which is to keep the occupation, clearly, but to make it as cheap as possible for itself, right? Israel doesn't want to have to deal with protests, for example, or rockets from Gaza, or resistance in general, if it can avoid it. And so it's tried to find a way to deal with the West Bank in one way, with Gaza in another way, that makes keeping the occupation as easy for itself as possible. And that's just something that is in the background of what I'm going to talk about. So, to get started on the content, before there was the terrible war on Gaza this summer, for 50 days, there was the largest Israeli military operation in the West Bank since the Second Intifada, pretty much, so for about 10 years. So after the settlers were kidnapped and killed near Gush Etzion down back in May, after that the Israeli army started this gigantic military crackdown in the West Bank, right? The biggest arrest campaign for probably about 10 years. Generally, this was the most visible that Israel made the military occupation of the West Bank for a very long time, and it had certain kinds of consequences. It was mainly in and around Hebron, but people felt it everywhere. But while I was reading this kind of news from a very long way away from California, I was also reading things on social media in which people were expressing how difficult they felt the fact that they could be somewhere in the West Bank and not really feel what was going on somewhere else in the West Bank, that things felt very fragmented, things felt very disconnected, and that they wanted to take part and share in the suffering of, let's say, Hebron, but that it was hard to figure out how you could do that in practice, what that would actually mean to express that. So just an example, this was before the war in Gaza. Somebody on Facebook from, I think, Bethlehem would write this: "You would never know that over 100 miners have been arrested in the past 3 days, mainly around Khalil. The recent settler violence in Jerusalem, you would never know any of it in Bethlehem, Beit Jala, Beit Sahur. Everything is so fragmented and disconnected, everything feels 10 million miles away from one another." And that frustration was particularly interesting to me because later on, when the war in Gaza started, many people here expressed similar feelings. It was, how is it possible that something can be happening, something like this can be happening in Gaza, which is not much further away than Hebron is from here, really, and there is nothing that we can really do about it in a way that feels appropriate somehow to the terrible tragedy being visited on Gaza. Now, after the crackdown, the gigantic Israeli military occupation around Khalil, the question was, what can the rest of the West Bank, what can Gaza, what can Jerusalem do to protest this campaign? And there was a new kind of, or different kind of problem, which is that if you're in Gaza and Israel is arresting hundreds and hundreds of people in the West Bank, there's not much you can do from Gaza either. Gaza has been famously and terribly locked up since 2005. You could have a demonstration in Gaza, but Israel wouldn't care and Israel wouldn't need to care. And if you protest and Israel doesn't need to care, then that's frustrating as well, right? You want, ideally, something that would make Israel react or make Israel stop somehow. That's very, very difficult, obviously, but that's the kind of general impulse that people tend to have. And so what happened was that there were many reasons why the war started. One of them was that, especially after the murder of Mohammed al-Qadir in Jerusalem, some rockets started to be fired from Gaza as part of solidarity with what had been happening in the West Bank for many months. Now, there are all kinds of other analyses of why this happened at that point, but the idea that Gaza had to do something given what had been happening in the West Bank was there partly. Now, what happens when rockets are fired from Gaza is that Israel knows what to do. It's almost a relief for Israel when it knows that, okay, the West Bank is difficult, arresting people is difficult, you don't want to really provoke people in such a way that you would have huge demonstrations. The West Bank is difficult for Israel. Gaza, in some ways, in terrible, terrible ways, is an easier problem for Israel. The minute there's a rocket, it knows that it can do whatever it likes, and nobody, especially not in the West, will really complain, because rockets are supposed to be terrorism, right? And so it's an easier equation for Israel. So what happened? Some rockets were fired from Gaza in solidarity with Jerusalem and the West Bank, and Israel turned around and effectively started the terrible 50-day war on Gaza. And when this started, on things like Facebook and social media, you read things like this by Haider Aid, who's a professor at Al-Aqsa University in Gaza. And I forget if he wrote this in English or in Arabic, but it almost doesn't matter. The feeling was quite widespread. After a few weeks of the war in Gaza, he wrote, could the new Palestinian unity government show some solidarity with the Palestinians of Gaza, please? Nothing more than solidarity. Now you can understand that when you're getting bombed and it's not clear who or what, if anything, can stop it, these are the kinds of feelings that you would get. You would want somebody in the West Bank, ideally your government, to say something or do something that would make you feel as if you are not alone in some way. That's a very natural desire. And so you saw quite a lot of this kind of thing on social media during the war and since, which is basically a frustration, which is how can Gaza and the West Bank be so disconnected and fragmented in the possibilities for one to do something for the other in practice. And that problem doesn't go away. In the last 10 years, it just gets bigger and bigger in some ways, which is that Israeli methods of control in Gaza and in the West Bank have been so effective in some ways in making it very difficult, if not impossible, to do something from Gaza for the West Bank, from the West Bank for Gaza, and so on, that the question of what can you actually do, because you can't do nothing, becomes very difficult, let's say. So I just move on a little to the question what people did do, because people in the West Bank did do a lot for Gaza during the war and since, and all the time in the last 10 years, but the kinds of things that they could do were quite specific, and it's why doing more than this is difficult now in the last 10 years that I'm interested in. So, for example, what's changed since 2005? So I remember days towards the end of the Second Intifada in 2004, late 2003, let's say, when some days, not all the time, but some days there were, let's say, 30 people killed in Gaza, which was, by the standards of the Second Intifada, a terrible day in Gaza, right? And I remember what happened here, which was generally, there would be a strike, right? If you had numbers like this, you would have a strike for 1 or 2 or 3 days. Now, this was fairly regular. It was basically the reaction that you could have here when something like this happened in Gaza. Now, this summer, and many, many times since the end of the Intifada in 2005, many, many more than 30 people were killed in Gaza on many, many days, right? Now, this summer in Ramallah, there were many, many things that were done when 50 or 100 or 150 people were killed in Gaza, right, on a given day. So many things were done in solidarity with Gaza. You could go and pack and send humanitarian aid at Mustad Kuwarid, for example, in El Bired. Everyone wore t-shirts saying, obviously, in solidarity with Gaza. There were signs everywhere in the streets. There still are. Right from Ramallah, you have a large sign from Baladiyat Surda saying Kuluna Gaza, right? I mean, this is, you could see it everywhere. You would hear the songs from Gaza everywhere in the street, so certainly it was very present. You had a boycott of Israeli products in a few places, quite a few places. Many people gave blood at hospitals since this felt important. It was difficult to know how the blood was actually going to get to Gaza, but clearly it was important for people to feel that they were doing something, right? So all of these things are enormously important, and they reflect a great popular desire to do something, right? To react in some way. But what there wasn't was also, I think, interesting and crucial in terms of the structural features of the last 10 years. What's different today compared to during the second intifada, let's say. How much more separated Gaza and the West Bank are today than they were 10 years ago. And not just because of internal politics, but also because of Israeli methods of occupation and control, right? So the main thing that happened in some ways was the one large march to Colombia from Ramallah on 24th of July, I think, so 2 or 3 weeks into the war on Laylat al-Qadr, which I think was called Masirat al-48 Alif. Now that was, like the crackdown before this, the Israeli crackdown, the biggest demonstration from Ramallah to Colombia, probably since the end of the Second Intifada. Again, right? It was a big deal. But it happened once, right? What didn't happen the next day, and it didn't happen the next Friday, and it didn't start a movement of that kind. It was very important, and several people were killed, and this is, it was a kind of very major and impressive and important event, but it didn't happen again. And it didn't happen again for various complicated reasons, but that in itself is important. Now, there are many reasons why it didn't happen again, but one of the reasons which is specific to the West Bank in the last 10 years is that there is a system of security coordination in place, right? And that one reason that you can't just go and march to your nearest checkpoint is that most of the time, before you get to the checkpoint, you will get to some Palestinian Authority police, and they will have to make a decision about whether to let you through or not. And the Kalandia March was an exception in that way. A few days before, 200 people had tried to march to Beitil, and they were stopped by the PA police, which is what typically happens these days. And at the time, some people said, the problem isn't that we're being stopped from marching to the settlement. The problem is that there's 200 of us, not 6,000. If there were 6,000, the PA police wouldn't stop us. Right? So the question is not, is it literally impossible to march to a settlement? It's why are there not 10,000 people trying to do it? And the reasons are very complicated, and I understand that very well, but that fact is kind of symptomatic in some ways of the situation. Now, I'm going to finish as fast as I can, but just with I'm a historian in the end, and what I'm interested in is the structural features of the last 10 years in a historical perspective. And so just to compare what happened with the war this year and what happened with the war in 2008-9. Now, what happened this time in the West Bank was much more than happened with Castlet in 2008-9. Now, in a very interesting article in the Journal of Palestine Studies called Operation Castlet in the West Bank, Rob Bletcher reported on some of the things that were said in the West Bank at the time of Castlet, which lasted 3 weeks, right? And one of them was a protest in Nablus, where the protesters were confined to a tent. Basically, you went to protest in this tent. And the local Fatah leader in Nablus said something which was quite typical at the time, was a tent is where you protest what's happening in Darfur, not what's happening in your own country. Right? This kind of sentiment, frustration, was quite widespread. More famously, the American in charge of training Palestinian security forces at the time, Keith Dayton, famously said in a speech in Washington, D.C. A little later, said this, quote, "Not a single Palestinian was killed in the West Bank during the 3 weeks of Israeli presence on the ground in Gaza in 2008-9. This is Dayton speaking. That's pretty good," he said. And he congratulated himself that the West Bank was so calm during the 2008-9 war that, quote, this is dating again, a good portion of the Israeli army went off to Gaza from the West Bank, think about that for a minute, and the commander of the West Bank was absent for 8 straight days. That shows the kind of trust that they, the Israeli army, were putting in these people, PA security forces, now, end quote. That was Dayton speaking about 2008-9. Now this time, it wasn't like that, right? So things have changed and are changing. This time in the West Bank, with this war, the Israeli army had to confront many protests, and it killed not 0, but about 25, 30 Palestinians in the West Bank in 50 days. Not 21, but still, this is a very clear and major and significant difference. But that still didn't happen because the Sultan let demonstrations happen. It just didn't just give up security coordination and let everyone go to the checkpoint if they felt like it. It was selective, and it happened in a big way once, because it would probably not have been a good idea for PA police to stop people going to Kalandia on Leila Tulkada. So there was a choice made, and that was an interesting choice. But at the same time, the difficulties of protesting on a mass scale everywhere in the West Bank at the same time remained in place, right? Tansikalandi is sacred, which is what the president has said a few times, and it's not going to be just thrown out of the window because there's a war in Gaza and you feel that you have to let people express their frustration. So to go back to the difference between Cast-Led and today, and I'm nearly done, in another article in the Journal of Palestine Studies back in 2008-9, just after Cast-Led, Azmi Bishara, who we all know, was asked, was that war, the first huge war in Gaza, a transformational moment or otherwise in Palestinian history? Did this change something fundamentally? And he had many points, but he said this, quote, this time even the language changed and people in the West Bank started talking about the West Bank's solidarity with Gaza. This is Azmi Bishara. He then said, this is new, what is expected of Palestinians in the West Bank and what they expect of themselves is not solidarity with the people of Gaza, but joining with them in an intifada against Israel. End of quote. That was Azmi Bishara, and I understand that it might be a lot easier to say this from Qatar than from Ramallah, right? But this is nonetheless, he had an interesting point at least. And obviously it was a deliberate provocation in some ways as well. But just to finish, there are limits to what the Sultan could do during this war, right? Those limits are complicated and they are interesting, but by nature they exist and they just have to be taken into account. And an intifada might not even be the answer to how to recreate an effective, common, popular mass resistance in the West Bank and Gaza at the same time, right? That's not necessarily a given either. But before, during, and after the war, the Sultan did have some symbolic options to show Gazans that it cared enough about them to put its own interest in stability at risk, right? And it didn't take them. And that is politically, historically, academically interesting. So it didn't take them last time when it didn't tell the UN to consider the Goldstone report, for example, and there were protests at that in Gaza, in which not very nice things were said about that decision. And it didn't do it this time when it talked a lot about joining the ICC, but in the end it didn't, right? And it still hasn't. And so just to finish off, on this question of joining the ICC, for example, which is complicated, but which is obviously effective solidarity, because it might be something that actually stops Israel from doing this again. It might not, but you never know. On this question, in some ways, this is something that only the Sultan could do, and that the Sultan was almost the only agent that didn't want to do this, it seems. Everyone else seems to want it to happen. Even Kremz and some of you heard signed to get this done, and in the end, it didn't happen. Now, the people in the West Bank can do and say many things to make Gazans feel that they are not alone, right? But some things only the Sultan can do, because only the Sultan has the Kursi al-Azraq, right? I mean, that's what it's for. There are some things that only the Sultan can do. And the ICC is in some ways the only thing that the Sultan can say or do from here to tell people in Gaza, the people who are doing this to you during the war, the people who have done this to you will pay, right? That we will make them pay. And it's interesting to me that it hasn't happened. And so that's what I was trying to say.